As we're coming out of the Roman era, we're going to look in this presentation at Byzantine and Islamic arts. So in 476, the barbarians sacked Rome, and the western part of the Roman Empire officially came to an end. Now, that was preceded by some of the elements you see here on this slide. Imperialism over a vast area that became progressively more difficult to control, and the acceptance of mercenaries into the Roman army so that there was less cohesion within that force. And this almost amusing fact here at the bottom, that between 235 and 284 CE, that should say, or AD, a total of 41 people were or claimed to be emperor of Rome. So the situation had really destabilized, even though the official end of the Western Empire was in 476. Rome was in decline for a few centuries. Now, in the 300s, the basic power and wealth of the Roman Empire was shifted toward the east. So Constantine the Great was the first Christian ruler of the Roman Empire. He did two crucial things that really changed the course of history and thus the arts during this time. First, in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which meant that Christianity was legal and sanctioned throughout the empire. And then in 324, he moved the capital from Rome, which was declining in population as well as wealth and stability. He moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium. He renamed it Constantinople. We know it today as Istanbul, but the power of the empire then had officially been shifted eastward. Now, Rome was in decline, but the Byzantine Empire was thriving, and this slide just shows some of the accomplishments of the period. They developed the codex instead of the scroll, and Emperor Justinian was able to document the Roman law into his volume called the Digest. The Hagia Sophia was built during Emperor Justinian's rule, and we'll look at that in a little more detail, but that's an amazing example in architecture. There's a real interest in the portable arts, such as ivories, silver vessels, smaller scale works. And another interesting aspect was that there was quite a bit of secular art, and especially in architecture, there are some great examples of secular architecture that survive from the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was at war with the Persian Empire, not barbarian tribes. It was a very different type of war that they were fighting. And the Edict of Milan is repeated here, but that was a crucial change in the status of the Christians in the Roman Empire. One thing that remains true even today is that the city of Istanbul, or as it was known during the time we're talking about, Constantinople, was the meeting point for Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Islam. So there are always both tensions and overlapping ideas because of that convergence. One interesting aspect looking at the Byzantine art and Christian art in general is that of icons. The word iconography means the depiction of sacred personages in art. Iconoclasm means the belief that those depictions are heretical, or that we should not try to represent holy people in art, that's a heresy. Now, this in part stemmed from some of the Hebrew artistic traditions, which really influenced early Christianity. But it was something that was argued about periodically over centuries. In the end, all branches of the Christian faith, both Eastern and Roman Catholic, came to accept icons as a part of their decoration in their church. But it was something that caused a lot of friction as Christianity grew. We're going to look a little bit in detail at the Hagia Sophia. This building spent 962 years as a church. It was originally a church. But then it was changed to a mosque, and for a long time has been a museum. It was built in 532 to 537 AD, and it's an Eastern or Greek Orthodox church. One interesting feature of the Eastern Orthodox Church is that there's more of a power dialogue between church and state. In other words, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has a pope who is the head of the church who answers to no secular leader. In later medieval times, the pope will come into conflict with kings. But at this time, in the western part of the empire, in the Roman Empire, really the pope is the only really powerful figure from, say, about 476 to about 1200. There wasn't really anyone to contest the power of the church and the pope. However, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the secular ruler actually appoints the pope, and then the pope is the patriarch or the leader of the church. But there is more of a dialogue between the two sources of power. Hagia Sophia, by the way, means holy wisdom, so that's the name of the church. This is a photograph of the interior dome of the Hagia Sophia, which is just enormous. The decoration inside is generally that of mosaics and painting. Sculpture was not their preferred form of ornamentation. When the Hagia Sophia was built, this was the largest church and the largest dome in the world. Here's another impressive photograph of the interior. When we talk about Byzantine style, a lot of times we're talking about the representation of human figures. So here are some of the characteristics of Byzantine style. It is anti-naturalistic. We saw in Greek art how the kouros, the young male figure, changed from the stiff Egyptian style pose to the idealized S curve of the high Greek and Hellenistic styles. Well, the Byzantine style is the opposite, is anti-naturalistic. It's not trying to make the ideal person. It has hierarchical formula, meaning that the placement and size of the people in this religious artwork will be depicted according to their importance. So we'll look at an example on the next slide where I can explain that. Generally, there's no sense of perspective. It's strictly two-dimensional representation. And the stylization of Byzantine art is definitely intentional. It actually increases through the centuries. One important element of the stylization is the word hieratic. That means that the human figure is elongated. So it's the fingers are elongated, the face is elongated. And another characteristic is this feeling of crowded content, that the space given is full. This is an example of Byzantine style. It's the Harborville triptych. And you can see that the figures are slightly elongated. If you just look at the proportions of the figures in the top middle compartment, for example, those figures on either side of the throne are elongated. That portion that I just mentioned, the top middle register, is Christ in the middle with Mary and John on either side. And you can see that those figures are placed in the placement of most importance. They are the top middle. And they're also larger than the characters who are off to the side. In the middle lower register, it's the 5 apostles of Christ. And so those are also large characters. They're more central to the religious stories, and they are represented as being more important. The medallions that you see off in the side are angels holding the symbols of the sun and the moon. You can also see the frontal pose, the lack of perspective. It's very formal and detached. Personal expression is not a priority. And these are all features of Byzantine art. We'll look at one more example of architecture. This is San Vitale in Ravenna, and it was built as a monument to Christianity, but it is in the West, actually. You can see that the narthex of this building comes out at a somewhat unusual angle, and people have theorized that maybe there was a street next door or an adjacent street that necessitated this angle, but then others have theorized that perhaps it was really just to sort of make a worshiper reorient themselves upon entry. This photograph, I'm sorry, it appears slightly blurred, but it gives you an idea of the interior of San Vitale. And what you're looking at here is the second level. It was called the ambulatory, and it was actually intended for the women. The men would have been on the main floor of the church, and the women on that second floor. San Vitale is in some way remarkable because it has more interior light than many churches of the early period. They used a special type of construction in the walls so that they could reduce the weight and have larger windows. This is the Miracle of the Loaves and the Fishes, which is a mosaic in San Vitale. And this just gives you a little bit more of an example of the Byzantine style. So again, we have frontal poses, no sense of perspective. Everything here is formal and somewhat rigid and stylized. If you look at the drapery on these people, the folds in the fabric are quite stiff, and it's not naturally flowing. The background here is golden glass, and there's no real natural or realistic scene being enacted. It sort of looks like a solemn ceremony instead of acting out the story of the loaves and the fishes. It's interesting to think that the artist for this work would have been well acquainted with Greek and Roman works. The works that we studied in the Greek and Roman unit were fully visible and were out in the world for people to see. So this was an intentional stylization. The artist wanted it to be simple, whereas towards the end of the Greek period and the Roman period, the observation of nature and the sense of realism was really important. Here, it's the sense of symbolism and simplicity that is being emphasized. We're going to look a little bit at Islamic arts. The Prophet Muhammad lived from 570 to 632 AD, and geographically speaking, the Islamic art would have been produced in very much the same area as Constantinople. In the two-dimensional art, the Islamic teaching forbade the depiction of human or animal figures in certain displayed art. It's important to realize that there are many, many representations of humans and animals in Islamic art, but just in certain displayed situations, it was not allowed. There were beautiful, beautiful books. We'll look at some examples of illuminated Qurans, and mosaic and abstract decorative design were the ornament of choice for a mosque. Music fell in and out of favor. It sometimes was frowned upon. Some people thought it should be banned, but really it was used for centuries, both as entertainment and in religious ceremonies. And the first major example of Islamic architecture is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It was built in the 7th century, and we'll look at that in some slides that come up later. This is a photograph of the Dome of the Rock. It's built on the site that is revered as the tomb of Adam, the place where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, and also the place from which Muhammad ascended into heaven. So the location is very important. Here's a slightly closer view of the exterior. And here you can see that the ornamentation and decoration, the abstract decorative work is really important to the interior of this mosque. The materials used include gold, glass, mother of pearl. So there are a lot of precious objects and different types of marble being used to create this ornament. Here's another ornamented arch from the Dome of the Rock. And one other place, or I guess you could say genre, in which you can see some really beautiful example of Islamic art is in the copies of the Quran that exist. The Quran was seen as the Word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and it's quite central to the religion of Islam. So the copies made and the way in which the copies were made are very, very important and considered very holy. There are a number of styles of Arabic script, but not all of them are seen as appropriate for copying Qurans. This one is in Kufic script, and you can see that's a very angular type of script. There are a few other examples here of illuminated pages. When you see an illuminated Bible, you very often will see the characters in a Bible story being depicted in the illumination. But here it's very beautiful patterns and decorative ornament. It is in some way natural when you look at the leaves and flowers that are depicted. So these are some of the Byzantine and Islamic traits of art during the period as the Western Roman Empire was failing and the Byzantine and Islamic cultures were flourishing.